So welcome to our next panel of the Galaxy's Greatest 45 Years of 2000 AD. And this panel is, for me, very much about the unsung heroes of the comics world. The people who, I guess, whose work works best when it's almost invisible. It is the colorists and the letterers. And we're joined by four absolute legends from the world of 2000 AD. Starting off with letterer Annie Parkhouse. Welcome, Annie.
Hi.
Colorist Chris Blythe. Hi, Chris.
I am.
Letterer Jim Campbell. Hi, Jim.
Hi.
And colorist Sally Jane Jurst. Hi, Sally.
Hello.
Wonderful. Well, I wanted to get you all onto this panel because, like I say, colouring and lettering are two of those processes in comics, which I think actually, unless people know a bit about comics, they don't really necessarily think about or pay much attention to. I think that's a real shame, just because of the creative craft of the two sides of the industry. So I wanted to get you on to talk a bit about the actual craft, you know, how you do it, how you do your jobs, how you approach your work, and also what you think the impact of colouring and lettering is on comics. Annie, I want to come to you first because I mean your career stretches back into, I think you started in 1970 in comics.
Mm-hmm.
You want to tell us a little bit? I mean, but based on what I know from what you said before, the world of lettering then is pretty alien to the world of lettering now. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the process that you learned to do in the 1970s?
The whole business was a lot different then, because people worked with agents. So you'd get sort of sad little men coming in with art bags, you know, sort of dropping off the artwork and then disappearing. So although we were working in an office, a lot of the time we didn't meet the artists. And was this pre-convention? I don't think I went to a convention until mid-70s. I can't remember which the first one was. I think there's some dispute as to who had the first convention. So there wasn't that meeting with the fans in the same way. It was very much a cottage industry, just sort of looking after itself. So I think we were probably even more invisible then than we are now. Yes, the art boards would come in. We would letter on patch paper and stick that down on the artwork. My job was in production, so I was doing a lot of reprint stuff, sizing up, redrawing where necessary. It's designing titles, doing all sorts of art studio stuff. But that wasn't for very long. I only did that for about 2 years, and then I was just overwhelmed with lettering work, and I couldn't have a life and a job as well as that. So I just went completely freelance, and it just went crazy. There was just so much lettering around in the early 70s. Yeah.
Because there were some comics. There was some attempt to do machine lettering to kind of
the IBM Golf Ball. Yeah, that was.
Well, okay, explain about this. That's a wonderful term. You can't just throw that in and then not explain it.
The golf ball.
Yeah.
Oh well, it was just a typewriter, and you got different fonts on it, like a golf ball that you dropped into the machine and then typed it. So of course, publishers thought they could just give it to their receptionist, and. And they would do it. And you still see some of that kind of lettering around. I think, was it something like Chicks Weekly or whatever I picked up a while back. And that lettering is just abysmal. It looked like IBM Golf Ball, yes. But then, of course, everybody thought they could do it. Oh, no.
Well, that's kind of what I want to explore in this panel, because, and I'm sure Jim will back me up on this. Lettering is an art, isn't it? It's not just a mechanical process. It is actually a creative process.
Sorry, Jim. Yeah, you carry on.
No, all I was going to say was, I mean, it's obviously it was a matter of sort of calligraphy and penmanship, and when it stopped being that, there is a school of thought out there in the wonderful world of internet criticism that says it's not, you just press a button and it's done now. But it's not. I mean, because I came from a graphic design background, so and a lot of times in newspapers, which was quite handy. So I spent a lot of time trying to squeeze unfeasible amounts of copy into spaces that were never designed to accommodate them, which served you quite well in lettering a lot of comics. So, but yeah, so it's the discipline has changed, but it doesn't make it easy. If you see what I mean? It's more graphic design now, whereas previously letterers like Annie would bring their hand lettering style to a job. Now, because you've got this wide array of fonts, you sit down and you think about a graphic design approach to picking the best fonts that visually will suit the tone of the strip and fit in the space that you've got available.
I mean, that's for me always been one of the fascinating things is there's a kind of this unspoken, well, not unspoken, but this layer of trust between the artist and the letterer, that the artist is going to leave enough space for the letterer to do their job, and it's one of the skills of the artist to leave that amount of space. And Annie, I mean, you must have many stories about seeing a page and going, where on earth am I going to fit all these words?
Yeah, I don't understand why artists feel that they have to fill the space. It's obviously they look at their page and they think, oh, that's it. I've got a corner up there that needs filling. I must draw in there, and nobody seems to pull them up on it. Mm-hmm. In the old days of the art editor, the artist would send in pencils and the art editor would assess how much lettering had to go. And if there wasn't enough room, he'd turn the pencils down. He'd send them back, and tell them to redo it.
It's not really that tricky. I mean, I have never lettered a page of PJ Holden's stuff that wasn't an absolute breeze. But PJ just says, if anybody ever asks him, he just says, I don't even thumbnail in the balloons anymore. I just leave the top third of the panel as dead space.
Yeah.
I don't draw anything in the top third of the panel. I'm not happy to get covered up.
I've had a good working relationship with Clint Langley because he used to sort of, brilliant artwork, but he used to fill every corner. And I gradually started to explain to him, like the design element and the pace element of balloons. And once he got it, it's just so much easier. So yes, I enjoyed working with Clint.
What's the key to good comic book lettering? Is there a simple rule that if you follow it, you part way there?
I think you ought to be able to read it even if there's no artwork there.
Right.
It ought to still read in the right order.
Yeah, the absolute first thing you need to think about is the flow, because if the reader has to stop and work out what balloon they're supposed to read next, you've blown it, basically. You pulled them right out of the story. But beyond that, I think it's one of the reasons why I think people don't quite appreciate what we do, is that it's an accumulation of tiny little choices, and you can get one or two or even three of them wrong, and it still looks kind of okay, but they stack up on top of each other. And the difference between good lettering and bad lettering sometimes. So it's like, you can probably get away with a not fantastic font choice if you're putting them in nice looking balloons and making the text into nicely shaped text blocks, and the line spacing is pleasing. But if you've got a nice font, but you're getting those other things wrong, it looks awful. But any one of them, you point it out to somebody and they kind of go, that doesn't seem very important. And you're like, in itself, no, it's not terribly important. But these things just stack up one on top of the other. And so, if you're not making your text into attractive text blocks, and you're screwing up the line spacing, and you're screwing up the positioning, and your balloons aren't very attractive shapes, they all stack up where one you could probably get away with and it wouldn't look terrible. As soon as you start to multiply these relatively small things together, it very quickly goes off the rails. And, whenever I used to do, when I used to do some of the lettering forums that used to exist, and I used to occasionally get asked to do critiques of people's work. And you'd see some absolutely terrible lettering, but I'd always start by saying, I can tell who's saying what, I can tell what order I'm supposed to read it in, and I can tell, I can actually read it. You've set it in Times New Roman and it's all in little square boxes, but at the end of the day, if I know who's saying what, I know what orders are reading it, I can read the text, your font is legible, it's not a disaster. It's not how I'd letter it, and it's not what a lot of people look at and think, well, that's traditional comic book lettering, but you've got all the basics there because I know how to read the page.
just thinking about how when it was more kind of you using paper and paste and whiteout and things like that, how the personalities and the styles of letters come through. Because I mean, the obvious example is Tom Frame, who much missed, but had such a, particularly on Judge Dredd, had such a distinctive font, a way of doing his letters. Is that still possible? Is it still possible to have your own style, your own flow, your own choices, so that somebody can look at something and say, well, I know who lettered that? Or has digital lettering opened it up to such an extent?
Obviously, people like Annie have got a font that's based on their original hand lettering, and quite a lot of the big US letterers have. I mean, Todd Klein's got his own font, Clem Robbins has his own font. I've attempted to design lettering fonts, and my hat is off to anybody, well, mostly Nate Picos and Comicraft, who supply the vast bulk of lettering fonts that we use, because I've had to go, and good God, it's boring. I mean, you do the interesting bit and you go, oh, right, okay, there's my main letters, and there's my variant letters, and that's all quite exciting. And then you go, now I've got to work out how to draw an ampersand and a percent sign and an equal sign and a plus and square brackets and curly brackets. And that just takes forever, because the bits that you'll use frequently take no time at all. And it's quite good fun designing them. But by the time you're into semicolons, you've really lost the will to live. And the thing is, once you've done all that, then you have to work out how to kern the thing, which is an actual art in itself, because you have to work out whether you need to adjust the spacing between every conceivable pair of letters. So the spacing between AV needs to be tighter than the spacing between AO. And you have to repeat that for every conceivable combination. And I believe, having chatted to Nate Picos at Blambot a few times, once you've done it for a few fonts, you kind of get a feel for it, and you drop everything into the same basic template and just see if it works. But even so, you're tweaking dozens upon dozens of pairs of letters every single time. So like I say, I mean, I had to go, and I decided, no, that's something that somebody who actually knows what they're doing should do. I'll just buy mine from now on. And yeah, there is an element of interchangeability, because we're all basically buying the same fonts, except people like Annie and Todd. But using them well and picking the right one for the right job is still a skill in itself. You don't want something light and bouncy for a horror story, and you don't want something grim and gritty for a comedy story. So you still have to make an informed choice about how you want the strip to look.
It's amazing how you would, when you were lettering by hand, how you would automatically kern it. I mean, yeah. you would actually see a space and you would letter to fill that space, and it was totally automatic. So it slowed me down a lot when I started using digital fonts, because I had to faff around with them and drink them, and
I had the very great pleasure of talking to Tom Orzechowski at the last New York Comic Convention I went to in 2019, in the before times. Because back in the before times at New York, the letterers would all get together and have a big old lunch, and it's mostly people sort of my generation. But Tom came down. Obviously, Tom lettered Chris Claremont's X-Men for 30 years, and so if anybody knows anything about squeezing extraordinary amounts of copy into very tiny spaces, it's Tom. And what was striking was he said you reach a point, he says, when you're doing it by hand, he says, I didn't even read the script. I wasn't conscious of these things as being words, because I was drawing letter forms. I'm not writing, and it's a mistake to think of it as writing. Because I had to go recently at a page by hand on acetate with sticky paper, and it is quite astonishing. The point where I kept finding it would go wrong was when I started thinking of it as being writing instead of drawing the letter forms. It's like inking. It's not like writing at all. And as soon as you start to think of it as writing, you lose that regularity and you lose the precision, and you start to introduce all sorts of little flourishes and things that you do in handwriting that you absolutely don't want in lettering. It's an astonishing act of concentration to hand letter a page. I have nothing but admiration for people who can do it.
Annie, just the whole thing about having your lettering style, your effectively your professional handwriting turned into a digital font. What was What was that like? Was that an odd experience?
No, I was quite pleased with it, and I'm horribly dogged about it because I'm still thinking of comics as the sort of ephemeral industry that I used to work in. And I'm thinking, but I am hand letterer, so why should I not use my hand lettering font? So, I mean, for better or worse, it has its faults. It needs tweaking, but I still kind of like it. And some artists actually ask for that. They want that kind of slightly quirky look about it.
I'm going to move on to talking about colour now, because again, this is an industry that has a part of the industry that has gone through a massive amount of change with the digital revolution, and attitudes towards colouring have changed quite significantly. Sally, I wanted to come to you. How did you get into comic book colouring in the first place?
Well, I was always a comic collector as a kid and things, so I've still got all my comics, but I ended up being a secondary school teacher and used Photoshop in that from Word actually to make resources for my kids, because they were all secondary but special educational needs, so I had no resources that I could use. And then eventually leaving that job, ended up going into doing book covers for publishing, and then got the opportunity to do a couple of things that were not colouring, but manipulating black line. And then eventually learned, well, it's all self-taught, but learned how to do flats, and then eventually got some jobs and carried on learning to colour.
I mean, what are your primary tools? I mean, you mentioned
Photoshop.
Okay.
really, really old Photoshop. It still does everything it needs to do. So I'm loath to touch anything because all my peripherals on my computer are ancient, probably clockwork. But if I move anything, it's just all going to crash and I'll have to buy stuff. It's working.
I want to see what if there's any contrast with Chris here. Now, Chris, have you got like a clockwork version of Photoshop running, or?
No, I've got the latest thing. It took me a long time to move on to it. Actually, I started on Photoshop 4, I think, back in the day, sort of 25 years ago or something like that, and I used that for a really long time, probably longer than I should. But again, it sort of did everything you needed it to do, and then bit the bullet, and because I knew there'd be a real learning curve from going from 4 to the latest CC 2000, 2020 or whatever it was, and there was a bit of a learning curve, but it's just phenomenal. I mean, it's moved on from being photo manipulation tool to being a full-on painting tool, and it's just amazing. You can build your brushes, you can make watercolor, you can make oil, you can make pastel, and make it really convincing too. So it's just a lovely Pandora's box of painterly tools, and that's what I like. I like the painterliness of it. I don't like the airbrushing, the old American look, which was kind of all you could do, I suppose, when digital came in. But now you can properly paint, and I love that.
And like Sally, did you come into the industry through kind of other means, or was this what you intended to be a colorist?
No, I mean, I was just a comics fan, but I used to manipulate images for book covers, which were usually models, but it was all digital, really. So I was a Photoshop. I used Photoshop in that way. I was never a painter. I am in kind of real life, but not digitally. I've never even really explored any of that stuff. I just do what I can do at the moment until I need to find a new thing, then I learn a new thing. But until I'm stuck, I'm not that brave.
I mean, Chris, what was your path into comic book colouring?
I started off as a cartoonist, and I started using Photoshop to colour the cartoons. I was working for Hodder and Stoughton, working on various books of theirs, and I started using Photoshop as a way of colouring it, because the turnover was so fast, and it was such a big body of work that we were doing. And then I think I was moving, and I rediscovered some old 2000 ADs, and I just sort of I didn't know anyone was digitally colouring comics at the time. It was a while ago, and I thought, well, yeah, there may be an application here, and people were doing it almost exclusively in America, and it was in its fairly early days. So I scanned in a few old black and white pages of I think it was like Halo Jones and an old Rogue Trooper or something like that. Cleaned it up in Photoshop and coloured it and sent it in. It wasn't a career choice. It was just kind of a curious thing to do. So I just sent it in to the then editor, who was few Thargs ago, David Bishop, I think it was, and yeah, just got a gig from that, which was a short Future Shock, and it very quickly took over everything, and it was never meant to. It was just a bit of fun, and it took over the whole lot, and has since led into other industries, games and movies and TV shows, which. Because of the way they are produced now, they use a lot of the same skill set with color scripting and previs and things like that. So yeah, that's how I got into it, and it was like, that was probably about 25 years ago. Of coloring thousands of pages.
That's smack in the middle of the kind of the point at which British comics were, full color. Because you look at that transition period in like the late 80s, where you had the fully painted revolution sparked by things like Slaying the Horned God, and then all of a sudden an industry that had been almost exclusively in black and white rush straight into color, and now it's black and white comics that are the rarity. I mean, over the time that you've been doing it, how much has comic book coloring changed, just in terms of not just what is physically possible, but also kind of like in the minds of people who are doing it, the imagination that goes into something like comic book coloring?
Oh, well, in the early days of digital, it's like that quote from Jurassic Park, just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean you should. So it was garish, it was bright, it was texturized, it had photos dropped into it, it had lens flares everywhere, and it was horrible. And, at the beginning, everyone's guilty of it, because you go from having to spend hours doing something to, I can press this button and produce this thing, and it's wow, that's amazing. But you shouldn't. It's horrible. So, and I think the readership very quickly cottoned on to not enjoying that kind of imagery, because it clashed so much with the line work. It wasn't servicing the artwork at all. It was like a kid jumping up and down the corner of a room, going, "Look at me! Look at this! Look, it's shiny!" And so it's changed in that respect. In that. Well, for me, it's way more painterly. It's way more going back to, I do it as if I was painting. So I will underpaint a whole page using painterly brushes, and then work into that. Quite an old-fashioned approach to it. I try not to mask stuff out too much. I do a lot freehand. I still use flatting layers, but I don't tend to use them slavishly anymore, because I just feel it just sort of constrains what you're doing. And it's a bit like looking at a blank page. Looking at a flatted page is it's quite a difficult thing to get over. So I put a layer on top of it, cover it, because some people call them rainbow pages, because they're just, if you don't know what they are, they're just it's a collection of very bright colors, so that your marquee wand can go in and select each area. So if you want to go in and put highlights and stuff in, you can have a mask that you don't go over the line. So I get rid of that very, very quickly, but I keep it there. So it's a more painterly approach, more cinematic approach. And I think sort of working in those sorts of industries has definitely influenced how I've gone back and worked on comic book pages.
I mean, that alone it was only something in recent years when I got to know and work with comic book colorists that I even discovered what flatting was. You know, it's like this hidden process.
It depends what the artwork is, really. Because the way, when I'm doing John Higgins's artwork, his recent style is very, to keep like the dynamism and the movement in the characters, he's using in between black line and the pencils. So having flats underneath, which are very marqueed, is quite useful. So the first layer would be one colour that gives you the feeling of the mood of that entire page if you had to do it in one colour. Then each panel on the next layer in the mood of those, the general mood of each panel, and then the flat. They're like, I kind of work in too many layers sometimes. I try really hard not to, because sometimes I've turned them off and then I forget and they get thrown away. But anyway, but with that, at least it kind of simplifies what the artwork is already very, very busy. And I don't want to be busy on top of that, if you know what I mean.
No, absolutely. Well, I mean, I was going to ask how you approach your use of colour, whether, you know, it's something that kind of speaks to you from the artwork, or whether it's something you decide, you know, the palette is going to be this in advance.
Well, I've got a palette of Judge Dredd colours for uniforms and things like that, but that doesn't mean anything, because the minute there's light source or anything else, those colours mean nothing. But if you have them on the flats, then at least it's not a trick or anything, but what I tend to do is I put my flats on 80% so that what's behind the mood colour affects all of the colours in that panel. Yeah. I could show you, but I can't show you.
I tend to look for the most interesting page, I think, and start from there with something that is episodic, like 2000 AD, and you've got a 5 or a 6 page story running over. You kind of have the privilege of just being able to go, right, okay, where's the money shot? You know, what's the artist really gone for? And there's always a page where they've obviously really enjoyed doing that page, and they've done this amazing. And I'll usually go to that first, and that will influence how that part of the story is coloured. So it's usually
if you're given all the pages in one. if you're fed one page at a time, you don't have that.
Do you get fed one page at a time? What do you work on that's
Sometimes I get 3. What happens is, as well, if it's this time constraint, so sometimes I think, especially on John's, if John knows which page is that money page, he might do that one first. He'll have done all the thumbnails and everything else anyway, but he'll work on that one first. So I might get that one first and have to work backwards. Sometimes they're in order, but I've got the script, so I know where it's going. And usually, well, especially if it's a second episode or something, I'm all good. But yeah, I don't generally ever get 10 pages or 6 pages in one go. Never.
Especially with the American publishers, I mean, you get sort of 22 pages, and that's really nice, because you can you actually get to sort of plan the storytelling. And that's the thing that's really changed in colour. It went from adding colour, and that was the sole purpose of colouring. You know, it's like and it was all local colour. It's like, okay, so that's red and that's yellow, and you know, you see it with like Dredd or something, you know, bright yellow shoulder pads, and of course, you know, they're never ever going to be yellow because of all the lighting and stuff that affects it, and you know, what's going on in the environment. And I think colouring's moved on from just, right, we just need to add some colour to it, to actually being an integral part of the storytelling.
You can do that from the script, though. If you didn't have any of the artwork.
Yeah, in the early days, I had to fight to get a script. You know, that colouring was so sort of, it wasn't particularly, it wasn't seen as part of the process in terms of it being that important. So I kept having to ask editors, can I see the script? And I go, what do you need the script for? So, well, I don't know what's going on. Is it?
There's no letters on it yet. Yeah.
That's one of the really bizarre things that I have, not from the House of Tharg, I have to say, but I am constantly having to badger editors to get the colours. The guy who just letter over the inks to be fine. And
I know, but that's time as well, isn't it?
There. It would be quite nice if it worked with the colour scheme of the, you know, That's in American comic, is why all the sound effects are yellow. Because half the time the letterer never gets to see the colours, and they just figure it won't go horribly wrong if it's yellow. But I think, you know, you're paying good money to have these pages coloured. Why wouldn't you want the lettering to complement the colours? It doesn't make any sense to me, but it's a constant battle. So
it's just that it's quite segregated quite often. So, you know, you've got pencils, you've got inks, you've got colours, you've got letters, and never the twain shall meet, which always surprises me, just how sort of segregated the process is.
And yet, bizarrely, I've been having this conversation with a couple of artists. It would make much more sense to move the lettering in that process back to where it used to be in the old days in the States, where it was penciled, lettered, inked, and coloured.
Yeah.
Because I've only ever done this once. I was on a really tight deadline, and I was working over inks, lettering them over the course of a week at the same time that the colorist was colouring those inks.
Yeah.
And he said, well, tell you what, can you send me the lettering as you finish it? So I sent him every page as I finished it. And he said, that's fantastic. He says, because I won't bother rendering anything that's behind it.
Exactly. I always have to stop myself from colouring a bit that I'm really interested in for some bizarre reason. And then thinking, but the letters are going there. What is the point of me wasting my time?
For everybody to have sight of the lettering and just not bother.
I once did a job for Gary Erskine that was running late, and he sent me just a blue line grid of how he was going to draw it. I lettered it completely blind, cut out the balloons and sent them to him.
So this is, I mean, this is one thing I wanted to talk about is that based on stories that people have involved in comics have told me, when, say, for example, an artist might be running late, it's the colorist and the letterers who bear the brunt of that, because the amount of time you have to do your jobs gets tighter and tighter and tighter the more behind they are. And I guess is one of the key skills of both colouring and lettering, just being able to do it quickly, to the speed of you know, making it look good, but being, you know, quick in that diagram, quick and good out of those 3 points, you know.
I think that letterers have a slight advantage over colorists in that, as you said, you can letter over roughs or over pencils, or it doesn't have to be entirely finished, whereas we have to wait right till the bitter end until we can start the process. And that can, you know, that can be right up against the deadline. And, you know, I've got any number of stories of deadlines going very, very wrong, because usually an inexperienced artist has just dropped the ball and put all his efforts into the first page, and then 20 pages on, has just gone to ground and refuses to answer any emails, and it's not an uncommon story. And so you have to know what's important on a page. In those instances, you've got to be able to turn something in that doesn't look like it's been turned in a tenth of the time it should have been. But it's a stressful time when that does happen, but it doesn't happen very often in the scheme of things. And, you know, especially with 2000 AD, I think it's probably happened once, and again it was with an inexperienced artist, and they dropped the ball quite spectacularly, and it rolled out the door, and that was an
uncolored.
Yeah, it was pretty close. Yeah.
Wait, I'll ask a question of Chris and Sally here, which is one I've already asked Jim and Annie. What's the essence of good comic book colouring? Is it, again, one of those skills that when it's invisible, it's at its best?
Difficult to say, because you don't generally see the uncoloured art against the coloured. So you can't even tell which one, you know, whether it worked or not. You'd have to get like 6 colorists to do the same page for you to be able to make any of those kind of judgments. Sometimes the art alone is beautiful, but I get to see it, but other people don't get to see it. So it's a complicated answer.
I think good colouring can save average artwork, and great artwork doesn't need colouring. You know, there's some artwork that comes in, and you're just like, well, this, it can go out perfectly as it is, and you just, you do some icing on the top of the already beautiful cake, but some artwork really needs it. You need to be able to draw the eye to the focal points and tell the story, because the artist isn't particularly doing it as well as maybe they should be. Again, it goes down to inexperience. The first professional gigs and things like that tend to be, you need a bit of a crutch to help them over the finishing line, which is fine. It's all part of the process. But yeah, I think it's I think it's becoming quite a very important part of the storytelling process. And I think you can tell, bad coloring tends to just be, as I said before, just local color. It's just tends to be very bright,
or everything's shiny,
very shiny
and balloon-like.
Yeah, the sort of airbrushing and which goes back to it's a style that's all you could do. And some people did it really, really well when they're really starting off with Photoshop. Photoshop was in very early stages, and companies like Ollie Optics and I think there was one called Liquid as well, who did the Spawn series, and they were quite sort of wow at the time, and they did it really well. But that started a style that took a while, that took hold for quite a while. Everyone wanted to look like that. And in fact, the first gigs I did, I think David Bishop showed me a comic and said, "Do it like that." That's really cool. And so we all sort of copied slavishly the styles before breaking out into our own style. And I always wanted it to look more painted. So before, the latest Photoshops that are so good at emulating real media, I used to scan in endless watercolor and oil paints that I'd make sort of paint textures, scan in, and then drop them in and sort of work them into the pages, so it looked like there was some kind of painterly process there. So it didn't have that, what they call van art look. You see the little vans that someone's spray painted a dragon down the side of, or whatever, and it's that kind of airbrush look that you just want to get away from.
It's interesting, interesting to me anyway, that you're talking about this process whereby the technology advances to the point where you're more or less aiming for an analog look.
Yeah.
Because it was, I recognize everything you said about the coloring, because it was like that when lettering went digital as well. Everybody was just like, chuck as many fonts as you can on the page, because you can. Every character's got a different dialogue font. Every sound effect's got a 4-color banded gradient across it, and it just looked horrendous. It really did. And it's interesting to me that process that you've described is sort of happening with a lot of letterers as well. We're trying to work out how to make the balloon strokes look more like they've been drawn with a pen.
Right.
So I've got one that looks like it's been drawn with a calligraphic pen. It's got a very slight variation. I've got another one that bleeds ever so slightly. So it's got, if the line works scratchy, I've got a balloon stroke that will bleed. It looks like I actually scanned it from an ink line and turned it into a brush and picked up the little bit of roughness you get from the tooth of the paper. And a lot of the fonts that are coming out now, especially some of Blambot's dialogue fonts, he's now, I said about how incredibly soul-destroyingly tedious it is to design a font. Well, Nate's now doing them with 6 different versions of every character. And because of the way fonts are designed, they've always been able to swap out letter pairs. If you put 2 letters next to each other, if you look at in a novel or some typeset bit of with a serif font, you'll often see if the F and the I appear next to each other, lowercase f, lowercase I, you'll see that instead of being 2 letters, it's 1, and the F actually loops into the I, and that's called a ligature, because the software knows to automatically swap that letter pair out. Well, Nate and also Comicraft to an extent are using that software, that bit feature in the font design software, to swap out multiple combinations of letters. So that if you write the word please, the software will automatically put a different version of the E in at the end to the one that's at the start. and it's almost unnoticeable, but it gives you that little bit of variation.
Humanity
that
again.
looking mechanical.
Mm.
And so we're kind of also the same as with colouring. We're coming back to a point where we're using all this technology to try and make it look like we were doing it by hand in the first place, which is amusing, I think.
Well, there's such a rich history, isn't there? And it was all hand done, and that's what's appealing about it. And I think that history of the production process is sort of innate within comics. So when they started getting very, very digital, you lost a bit of its soul. And so going back, even though you're doing it with state-of-the-art technology, you can make it look like it's been done with watercolor, for example, or you can make it look like it's done with oil paint, going back to the sort of 80s, the Simon Beasley era of fully painted comic books.
It also worked the other way, that you were talking about everything looking airbrushed. Colorists would make things look, but that was a spin-off from when people were actually airbrushing the artwork.
Yeah.
I mean, Annie, as someone who started their career in that analog age, I mean, is there a kind of sense of irony about this conversation that people spending all this time trying to make it look like it used to be done,
but faster?
It was making me think of you talking about colouring. Colouring used to be so simple because you only had two colours. You had 100% and 50%. So colouring was done on the back of a film. You'd have a film that you would then colour in blue or red on the back of it, and that would tell the printer whether it was 100% or 50% colour, because it was still hot metal as well. So if there was any sort of mistakes, you'd have to phone up the printer and say, could you chip it out? Doing lettering corrections by chipping out was very expensive, as I remember.
And that's the key. That's the key, isn't it? It's Control Z. That's what it all boils down to. Is you can try things, and that's the beauty of it. That's why I like starting with huge, big, broad strokes. Is it's just trying to get a feel of what that page is about without committing to anything at all. You can obliterate it and then pare it back and start going into it, but you can always get rid of it. And that's the beauty of it. And I paint in real life as well, and sometimes you have your brain going Control Z when you do something because it's not right, and it's like, I have no idea. I'm in the real world now. I'm going to have to commit to this, and it's a mindset, that's for sure.
Another thing that's very different is the fact of transportation. The fact that I can work with a guy in New Zealand, but I can remember. Steve and I were just talking about it last night. I was working for Dark Horse, and the artwork was coming from a studio in Croatia. So they were sending me boards of artwork, and then they were being FedExed to California, because it was California then. And communication was I was on holiday at the time, and communication was by a phone box. It was like Local Hero, having to phone Croatia to tell them where I was and what was going on. I mean, that made it exciting.
Yeah, that's the other side of technology, isn't it? I mean, when I started out, it was you'd get the artwork sent to you, which was lovely. I missed that because you got to see it in the flesh. Yeah. And it's, when you get an amazing piece of artwork in, it's like, it's lovely. You get to see the bones of it. And anyway, and then I had a massive flatbed scanner and scanned it, had to send them back, had to burn everything to CD afterwards and send it. So, I spent a fortune in postage, if nothing else. But now you can just fire it across the world and it's there instantly.
It's one of the things that miss about being in the office. One of the few things I miss about being in the office was that, Simon Davis, Colin McNeil, John Burns, the only remaining artists who actually physically send us their work. So it did come in and we'd be able to gaze in all its glory. One thing I wanted to touch on was specifically about 2000 AD, because in the conversations had with artists and writers for this show, the one thing they've stressed more than anything has been the sense of freedom that they feel that they have, not just to do what they want, but from an editor in Matt who trusts what they do and allows them to just get on with it. And I wondered whether this actually also filters down into colouring and lettering, whether you all feel as if you have a sense of expressive creative freedom to be able to practice your craft in the way that you want to. I mean, Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think I've ever actually had any notes from Matt, unless something is actually wrong, like I've coloured something green and it been established as red. I don't think I've ever had a note from him. And just going back to something you said, Sally, about turning off a layer and forgetting to put it back on again. There was the one time I got a note from Matt was one of these flatting layers or rainbow layers that some people call them, which are just horrific. There was one little judge in the background who I hadn't gone over for whatever reason. So he was there in the background, green and purple and pink and all sorts of things. And he was a tiny little thing, but Matt spotted it, thankfully. And he sent me a little note just saying, "Is that what you wanted that judge to look like?" As if it was some sort of creative choice. I'm sure he's just being very polite and sort of, kid gloves. It's like, "Are you sure you want to do that?" It's like, yeah, no, I didn't. No, but yeah, he's completely hands off. It's just like, here's the thing, go for it. And yeah, as long as it's not late, it's all good.
All the pages I do for John, I give them straight back to John first anyway. So he sees them and then I go through it all pixel by pixel and then it goes out. So I've got double belt and braces.
I mean, do you feel able to pursue the colouring in the way that you want to? Not just that other people are seeing it, but that it is it's an expression of your approach, your touchstones, your palette.
Yeah, I think I remember doing one I can't remember who the artist was or what the story was, unfortunately, but I pretty much did it monochromatically, just as a bit of an experiment, which was and it kind of suited the story, and I just thought this would be quite cool if it was just done in a really, really limited palette. And no comments at all. It's like, yeah, fine, cool, off you go. Which was fun. It's fun to do. It's fun to be able to do stuff like that without. It's really different with the big publishers. They're way more controlling. Obviously, their characters are huge, great industries now, and you've got to get certain aspects of it right, and you might well have quite a strict palette to adhere to and that kind of thing. Which, yeah, that's why it's so nice to work for 2000 AD. Is in the same way that the artists who draw Dread, for example, it's different every time. Who's drawn it by how the helmet is, or how the bike changes every time a different artist draws it. The gun changes every time a different artist. It's different every time. There's that kind of freedom. It doesn't matter. The character's bigger than the props that he uses. So in that same way, I mean, I don't think you get away with colouring in pink or anything, but
no, we're all speaking the same language. You've just all got a different accent. That's all.
Yeah, which is nice, and it keeps it fresh as well.
And Annie and Jim, what about you? Because I mean, we've talked about how different strips might have different ways of lettering them, different fonts, different approaches. Is there that amount of trust, that you get the script, you get the artwork, off you go, fantastic, thanks very much?
The one thing I would quite like to do, when you were lettering by hand, there was a lot of different sizes and weights of fonts, and I think that added to the drama. And I think Matt likes to keep it fairly tight. Whenever I've tried to creep up my bolds a bit, in a sort of old style, he has pulled me back on that. But working with Clint, he really liked that kind of old-fashioned lettering. So yeah, he would make me do really big bolds in the balloons and things, which I sort of kind of like, but it's just different.
Well, I mean, I'm the newest droid on the block, having only been in 2008 since 2019. I think the second thing, the 2000 AD that Matt gave me, was the most recent Sorcerer of Zilk. And I did do a test page for Matt for that, because I wanted to do something that didn't look like any of the other lettering that was currently in the prog. And it's, you know, it was quite quirky, but I thought, well, you know, it's Brendan and he's a mad genius. So, and I knew that there was no way that this strip was going to look like anything else in the prog. So I sort of, I improvised a lettering style. Well, I didn't improvise, I cobbled it together from sort of other things that I'd done. I thought, well, actually, I drew these rather quirky hand-drawn balloon shapes. And for another job, I'd used a comic graph font. And when I started using it, it wasn't intentionally on their part supposed to look like Steve Parkhouse's lettering, but it kind of did. And I thought, you know, if I stretch that a little bit, just up the horizontal scale a little bit and space it out ever so slightly, that's going to look quite a lot like Steve's hand lettering, which I adore, by the way. If you get a chance to tell him, Annie, please do, because I've always adored Steve's hand lettering. It's marvellous.
He loves that.
So I thought, you know, that's not going to look like anything they've had in the prog for a very long time. So I did this, I just put this page together and said, I was thinking of doing something like this. Are you okay with that, Matt? And I sent and emailed it off to him, and very shortly after, I got one back saying, no, I quite like that. He says, oh, by the way, it reminds you of Steve Parkhouse's hand lettering. I was like, well, that's a result, isn't it? But that's the only time. And because since then, yeah, I just thought, well, you know, he wasn't, you know, he really was just like, no, it's fine. I trust you. It's great. Get on with it, you know. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, it took me a long time to get into the prog. I mean, I've been doing this for 12 years, I think, before I got the call. I mean, I've done bits and pieces for Rebellion, but not in the prog itself. So I think, you know, Matt has a certain amount of confidence that I know what I'm doing. And I think it just lets me get on with it. And, you know, like you're saying, if there is a line, I haven't crossed it yet, but I'm sure he wouldn't hesitate to tell me if I did. But, you know, he's quite happy to basically do what you want, and he'll just let you know if he doesn't like it. And most of the time, it's absolutely fine. I mean, he's like Chris said, I don't think Matt's ever asked me to change something because he didn't like it. He's only asked me to change something because it's been wrong. You know, I've accidentally pointed a tail at the wrong character, or there's a typo that's crept through in the script. And that's literally all I get in the way of notes from Matt.
I mean, it's interesting that 2000 AD, I mean, this is particularly true of lettering and writing, has a very kind of tight cadre of names, you know. Thinking about the four of you, but also, you know, the much missed Tom Frame, Ellie DeVille. You know, it feels like there's always that level of trust. It's like, you know, these are our people. Yeah, these are the names that we go back to again and again. I mean, do you get a sense of that? That, I mean, particularly for you, Annie. I mean, like you say, you've been working for 2000 AD for some time. Do you get a sense of that? That, you know, there's that kind of, these are our people and they do our thing.
Yes, I think so. And I mean, after Ellie, we knew we couldn't manage with just two letterers. You know, me and Simon. So yeah.
But I mean, when you think about it, I mean, Simon sort of really only stepped up to a sort of a more than a fill-in role when Tom died. So I mean, that's how stable the lettering roster is for 2000 AD. It really is one in, one out. It's one out, one in, which is sobering, but
yes, it is. Taking my age into account.
Do you think that that's a kind of stabilizing effect? That, you know, because it is people who know what they're doing, who know the comic, and this applies, I guess, to lettering and coloring as well. That you know, it produces a certain stability, a certain consistency. I mean, Chris, you've been coloring Judge Dredd for how long now?
Yeah, 25 years, maybe on and off. Yeah. So I think, I can't remember who said it, but they said Dredd, they quite often try out new artists because Dredd is big enough to take it, you know, as a character. He's big enough to take a new style and all that kind of thing. And I think for not less so now, but for a long time, I was kind of the continuous factor in Dread when they were having lots of new artists coming in, was that I would be colouring it and give some kind of continuity to the character. I mean, I don't know how I ended up on Dread. I used to do all sorts of stuff, and then it just became the Dread guy.
Well, the thing is, sorry, to say, the thing is also, I mean, 2000 AD is a beast, isn't it? I mean, it just needs to be continuously fed content. And my hat's off to anybody who can sort of keep that beast rolling along. And I think it's very important to that process that Matt can just forget about the colouring, forget about the lettering, because I've got people who can do that. I know they can do that. Here's the script, here's the pages, get on with it. Because, you know, the guys, the writers and the artists who are originating this content, he's got to try and wrangle them in and be looking at this schedule 6, 8, 9 months down the line and mentally trying to slot things into all these issues week after week after week without fail. It's a hell of a job.
Yeah, and that's something else where this digital age is so helpful in that, like we were talking about the old days where everything had to be done by post and everything was sort of done by hand. You had to have enormous lead times, which you don't anymore. And so often, I finish my part of it and it's uploaded and it is at the publisher, all on the same day. So you can just work right up to the wire, and the lead times are a lot shorter than they used to be. Even when everything's running smoothly and everything's running as it should do, it's still, a couple of weeks as opposed to, a couple of months.
Just to kind of round things out, you're all people who've worked for 2000 AD, have a sense of what it is able and to do with storytelling, with heart, with writing. Do you feel that colouring and lettering is valued? Do you feel that that you are part of the creative team, or do you feel a bit separated out from it?
the strange cousin on the sidelines. Yeah. I mean, I think there is a kind of pecking order. I think which. I don't know. It's an interesting question. I don't know. You tend not to get quite the same sort of recognition, but whether you should or not, I don't know. Like you said, you're kind of the unseen part of the equation. It's like they used to say about special effects. If you can see a special effect, it's not a good special effect. So if you're looking at colouring and going, wow, look at all that colouring, it's probably not a good thing. It's probably a bit too much colouring going on there. So I mean, I don't know whether you'd have to ask people who read the comic. But I think as far as editors go, I think they all know the value of colouring and lettering.
It's a big team game, though, isn't it? So if you support Arsenal or something, you say I support Arsenal, but you might have your star player. That doesn't mean the rest of the team weren't there on the day, and everyone support. I feel part of the team, and I'm happy with that bit. That'll do me.
And Annie, what your feel? I mean, you've seen out several thugs over the year. Well, several thugs minions, shall we say, over the years. Has the approach to letterers always been the same, or has it varied between regimes?
It's been fairly stably the same, I think. Yeah, I can't think of any big differences between editors. And of course, prior to 2000 AD, it was Revolver and Crisis, and and the IPC stable. No, they've all been much the same, I think.
Wonderful. Well, we are now completely out of time. So thank you to all four of you for what was an absolutely absorbing chat. It's just such a fascinating subject. So thank you for all your work you do for 2000 AD, and thank you for giving us a little peek behind the curtain.
Cheers, Mike.
Thank you for giving us time, Mike. Cheers, appreciate it.